Okay, in our last part, I kind of went through the 4 marks of the church. Now I'm going to dive into the different states of life in the church. This is part of our constitution. This is part of how it works. In the classical sense, we talk about the hierarchical church, the laity, and consecrated life. All of the Christian faithful are part of the people of God. We are called to exercise the mission which God has entrusted to His church. The vocations and the different ways of life are equal in dignity. It means that one vocation is not better than another. You can't say if you are a hand that you do not need a foot. That's one of the images used in the New Testament. And so I think this is a piece. Older authors talked about this more often, that like the vocation to chastity was better than being married. Like it was one of the only hopes for salvation. And now I think that we can recognize the beauty of that because it anticipates in this world living for the kingdom of heaven. But that kind of language we would not use as frequently because it makes it sound like being a priest is this path to holiness, or being a bishop is a greater path to holiness, or being a religious is the greatest, and because you have all this time to pray. And there can be a truth that having the time to pray is a beautiful gift and part of this role in the kingdom of God, but it's not, that doesn't make it better per se. It just makes it different. If someone is not called to the religious life, they're not called to the religious life, and it's not good for them to try and live a religious life. So I think that this is a place where there has been a lot of reflection in the modern world, and a lot of helpful reflection to see the dignity of marriage. Now certainly part of it is that there was a lot of suspicion in the fathers of the church with things like sexuality. That sexuality is easily a path that leads people astray. We live in a modern world like that. And that's true even within marriage to a certain extent. That these things within us can be a bit like fire, and if we get too close to it, we can get burned. It can become something that isn't good. So it's just important to emphasize that there is a multiplicity of vocations and that they're different. Some of the saints talk about them as different kinds of flowers, as different things like that. And lilies and roses and tulips and more. So we don't want to say that one vocation is necessary or one vocation is better, because the truth is that the best vocation is the one that God has called you to, the one that He has made you for, the one that you are prepared for. Sometimes, actually, one of the great challenges you will face is if you find someone who feels like they're in the wrong vocation. They feel like God was calling them to be a priest. They said no, they got married, they raised a family, family life was hard, maybe it didn't go well, and now they're in difficulty. Or they became a religious and they were really called to marriage, but they were scared of it. That you'll probably encounter less frequently now, but it's very possible. I think it's important to emphasize that a vocation is something that is also constitutive. Like the meeting place of some different things makes a vocation. So if you have someone who believed that God was calling them to the priesthood and they didn't get called, or they didn't respond to that call, they didn't go to seminary, they didn't do that, and they ended up getting married, are they now in the wrong vocation? Are they sinning by leaving their marriage? And I think the best answer is no, because a vocation isn't just a call from God, it also has to meet the desire of the person, and there has to be a union between them. Like, God has to will it, you have to choose it, and it has to be affirmed and confirmed by the church. And you need all of those together. If you don't have that, it is lacking. So if someone didn't go to seminary and got married, the question of what their vocation was is a little bit hard, and sometimes you have to sit with them in the midst of suffering. But the reality is, now they are called to marriage, because that was a place where their desire met God's desire, and was confirmed by the church. Now their path to holiness is living their marriage well. Certainly, you can encourage them to pray. Sometimes they can be good candidates for the diaconate or something like that. There's ways and expressions that can really help someone who is in difficulty. But for the most part, if they're in distress about it, it's important to be with them, like we've talked about so often. But it's a good thing to consider. It's a powerful question. What do you do when someone feels like they're in the wrong vocation? What do you do when someone feels like they missed it, they married the wrong person? We, in a way, have to have an answer for that. The differences between vocations are at the service of unity and mission. There is diversity and richness. Each person working in the sphere that God has given them helps and builds up the others. This is part of that body thing. So hierarchy and laity go together. Religious can come from both. Religious live out the evangelical counsels, and they sort of exist in both worlds. That in some ways, religious life isn't a separate sacrament because it's seen as a perfection or a living out of a baptismal calling, not so much a unique sacramental gift per se, but taking one of the sacraments and living it to a greater degree. When we talk about the hierarchical constitution of the church, we go back to Christ. The foundation stone is Christ. He builds that upon the kingdom of David in Israel, and even back further upon the gathering of the covenant people at Mount Sinai, like I mentioned in the earlier videos. Jesus himself sets up and decrees these offices, though. He desires these offices to continue. So the first office that he institutes is that of apostle. We see this in his life. And it's a fascinating part of the scriptures because around Jesus there's a larger group of people that aren't included in the scriptures. We see it come out several times when someone shows up in a story for the first time and it says, well, they've been with us since the beginning. If they've been with them since the beginning, they've always been there. They're just not being mentioned by the authors. That happens with Matthias and Eustace. The two that were put forward as possibilities to replace Judas. Ultimately, St. Matthias is chosen, but it's a very different kind of moment when you realize that there's these other people around, and the apostles are listed because of their office, because of their role in the church. So the hierarchy is meant to be in service of the body. It promotes the whole interest of the church. It's meant to lead and guide, to be a bit like a skeleton. Within this church, no one proclaims the gospel to himself. We act in the name of Christ for others. Ministers are authorized and empowered by Jesus himself. We talk about acting in the person of Christ. There's this big debate, and it happens historically. In persona Christi, what does that mean? In a way, it means acting like a Christian. In a way, it means fulfilling the call of your baptism. In a way, it means living a normal Christian life. But we apply it specifically, or we think of it more specifically, in regard to ministry and priesthood and episcopacy. The way that it comes down to us in tradition is that bishops and priests act in the person of Christ the head, in persona Christi capitis. A new form of this has kind of come about for deacons that act in persona Christi diaconia. I always felt like this was a little bit off-putting because I feel like it almost introduces a division where I'm not sure there should be one, but it's part of our tradition, and one of the beautiful things of being Catholic is that we don't have to agree with all of it. We wouldn't have to say, well, this is the way that I would do it. We're not asked. We're just given it. And given it, can we be obedient to it? Can we see what's important? Can we see what's at stake? Can we enter into the reality that we're invited to? So, in persona Christi diaconia means in the person of Christ the servant. that deacons are related to service at the altar, service of the priesthood, service of the people of God. In many ways, deacons are the real bridge between the clergy and the laity. Deacons are usually, in our day, chosen from the laity. They become part of the clergy in a way, but often retain their married state. And they really have this kind of gift of bridging what is pure clergy and pure laity. And I think this can be hard for deacons as well, because you have to have a little bit of a divided heart. In this case, divided not in a bad way, but you do have a role and a duty to your family and to your bride, and to take care of them, to lead them, to guide them. That is all true. But you also have and acquire a duty to the church and to the people of God. And some of it is balancing between those two dimensions and those two duties. Very often it looks a little bit different for deacons who are still working and deacons who are retired. That can be very different. But deacons are ordained in the person of Christ the servant. At least that's the strong emphasis that comes out. In a way, I would say that deacons are still functioning the person of Christ the head, certainly when they baptize, when they celebrate the sacraments. In some places, if they're given governance or charge of a parish, that can happen. Sometimes a deacon's an administrator and a priest comes in to celebrate Mass. It's not a good situation, but it has happened. Jesus and his presence wants to work through the sacraments. The hierarchical constitution of the church is very much related to her sacramental life. It's not something that is meant to be separate. The hierarchy in the church is not meant to be one of lordship and authority and power as the world conceives it. It is very much meant to be a life of service to the body and organization for everyone else. All degrees of ordination are oriented toward service. So all of the character that you receive through the gift of holy orders is all about service. And that service aspect, giving of yourself to other people, is common to all Christians, to the whole body of Christ. It's not just something for the clergy alone. Ministry in the hierarchy is called to be collegial. God doesn't give every gift to every person out there. We need each other. The apostles form a group. They're a group of 12, not one. And this is something that we have experienced in the church, in the Roman Catholic Church especially. We live in a kind of tension with this, because canon law will profess that the Pope has immediate authority within the church in a way to do what he wants. He can intervene in conflicts, he can issue decrees anywhere and everywhere. But in a way, that's a really bad sense of what the Pope is and what the Pope should be. That the Pope is not meant to be a dictator. He is not meant to control and to rule all and to rule everything. And anyone who's been a manager can tell you that that doesn't go well. You cannot do that in a company. You cannot do that on a wider scale with the church and dioceses around the world. That the authority of the Pope, in a way, is meant to be an authority of appeal, is meant to be an authority of service, an authority that guides and coordinates, so that there's unity within the liturgy, so that things aren't dramatically different from one side of the United States to the other. That kind of thing. So even the Holy Father is meant to exercise his ministry collegially. And you can actually see this in the background of some of it. This isn't always done well. Sometimes authority and power is exercised badly. Sometimes it is like the Gentiles. Sometimes it isn't what it should be. But even like the Holy Father, Pope Paul VI, for instance, in his famous document Humanae Vitae, much of it he borrowed from and lifted from a group that he had appointed to study the question on contraception. That there were people that were genuinely asking and looked at the tradition of the church, and the Pope used other writers to help him write the encyclical. That's true of all of the major documents. That's true of things that the bishop does, that there is consultation on it. There's meant to be a fraternal unity. That hierarchy is meant to be a fraternity and a brotherhood and a coming together of people using different skills. Even, I think, in our own day, there is more of an openness to look at how women are meant to be a part of this conversation as well, in how authority is exercised. And are there some positions and some structures that in the past have been reserved to men or clergy that can be open more widely to women? And we've seen that the answer is yes. That doesn't mean we want to throw babies out with the bathwater. It's not meant to be about women's ordination. That's been litigated to the ends of the earth. I think John Paul II definitively settled it when he said, we have no authority to ordain women. But there is a recognition of the difference that feminine voices bring and the beauty that feminine voices bring, and that's something that we need to grow into as a church. How we grow into that, I don't know that the Catechism says. I think that there are places and some things need to be studied and maybe tried with some gentle exercise of governance and to see what happens. Certainly, there have been places where hierarchy has been used poorly in the past, and there are places that it has not been done well. Those kind of moments are tragic. Those kind of moments are really not supposed to happen, but the reality is they're not unique to men as men. They're part of human nature as human nature, and so women face the same struggles. Women in authority and women in office don't get over the difficulty of leading people well. Ministry as a group, as a collegial body, is meant to be collaborative and to be encouraging. Even bishops are meant to be part of an episcopal college, and a bishop forms a council of elders with his priests in his diocese. There is a link between all of these that is meant to be preserved, that we would say is willed by God. Jesus, the beginning of the church, doesn't appoint Peter to lead it on his own. He appoints a group of 12. Certainly he calls Peter out of the 12 to be the person and the symbol of unity, to guard that unity on behalf of the brothers, to be able to make determinations, because you need someone like that. But you can't limit the exercise of authority to Peter alone. And we've seen a bit of a swing with this. The First Vatican Council very much emphasized the authority of the Pope, and it's really the Second Vatican Council, one of its major revolutions, was much more about the episcopacy and even the priesthood and their relationship to the Pope and the bishop in his diocese, because that was a weak point after Vatican I. So in Vatican I, there was this emphasis on the Holy Father. Vatican II walks it back a little bit, not like the points of dogma or doctrine, but just in the practical exercise, that the Pope, while he does enjoy this kind of authority in virtue of his office, is not meant to use it constantly. He doesn't rule every Catholic in the world. He exercises that authority most especially in safeguarding the unity of the church, and it's up to the local bishop, who with his priests and his people forms a real particular church. Ministry has a personal character. So it is collegial, it is meant to be exercised collegially, but that is not to diminish its personal dimension. That it is also received through a vocation, through a personal call, through a life of holiness. Ministry, we can see that it is a person who stands in the person of Christ. We share in his priesthood and his rule. When we do things like say, I baptize you, that it's an individual, it's a personal action. It's not meant to be something of a group. That there's this balance that you almost have to feel. Like the church is collegial and the church is individual. It is me and Jesus in a personal relationship, but it's also me and a body of the faithful part of the church. That I have a duty and a role, and you have a duty and a role, but that duty and role is exercised within a greater body and a greater whole that we are a part of. And so you need to do your part, I need to do my part, but we also work together in concert with each other. So the individual is important. It's not just collegial. It's not just limited to one thing. The personal character of the hierarchy also means that we are called to try to configure our lives more and more to Christ, to try and be more and more like Jesus, to become transformed in Him and transformed by grace. Okay, the Episcopal College with the Pope. So the 12 are part of a permanent assembly united with Peter at their head. The Roman pontiff Simon Peter alone is made the rock of the church and entrusted with the keys to the kingdom of heaven. This apostolic foundation continues into our present day with the Pope and the bishops. The Pope is a visible source of unity and foundation. We call him the Vicar of Christ, but he is also the servant of the body. He possesses in himself full, supreme, and universal authority within the church. In the church, the Pope can intervene anywhere for anything, but it is not a power to be exercised lightly. And we've seen this become problematic time and again. Popes with personal vendettas, popes with personal ideas, it has ended up getting them into a lot of trouble. This kind of authority is given, and part of it is also because of the Roman system upon which the empire was founded, and some of which is adopted into the church. We see its structure, for instance, in dioceses. That's a Roman concept. The Romans had dioceses. That was the Roman name for provinces. So this is an authority that is given, but is meant to be exercised in a way only in service of communion, only in service of bringing people together. And I think we need to think very carefully about this, that we live in an age where people have somewhat funny ideas about the Pope, and sometimes popes have had somewhat funny ideas about what they should do. There are cases, for instance, where there's a conflict in a diocese and you need a kind of authority to intervene. It is great to have the Court of Appeal be to the Holy Father. That is very true. There are times and places where that exercise of authority and having another level beyond the bishop has been very, very protective for the church. There are other cases where this has gone badly, where it hasn't been used well. And we live in this age that it is hard to say, because John Paul II is a saint now, kind of a lion of a man, and really carried the moral banner of the church, especially in pro-life things, in a way that that I think we can be very proud in, that Catholics turned to him and it was like everything the Pope said and every homily the Pope gave was carefully studied by theologians and poured over as sources of doctrine. And Benedict was very much the same way. He had, a brain the size of who knows what, and just was able to pour out, lived in the heart of the church. I think that was relatively unique to those two men. We see in Francis someone who does not think about the church or the role of the Holy Father in the same way. And you can see it in a good sense, like, for instance, in his homilies given for daily Mass. He wants the freedom just to be able to preach and not have every word of his be scrutinized. They release summaries of them. I think there's a beauty to that, because not every person can speak as if the world is watching all the time. That just doesn't work. So there's this deep sense of the Holy Father has an authority, but it's an authority that's meant to be used gingerly and sparingly for the good of the church. And it's really meant to be exercised in collegiality in service of communion. The College of the Bishops must remain united with the Pope. You can't have a revolt of bishops without the Holy Father. That is specifically disallowed in history. It goes way back to problems like conciliarism and some of the councils, Constance and Basil in the church, that were kind of a mess, especially in the transition of the late Middle Ages into the Renaissance, and into the early modern period. There was this idea that the Pope serves only at the institution of an ecumenical council. That's where authority is exercised, and that bishops can get together and do what they want. And in a way, I think the Roman Pontiff and the Church, the catechisms, try to see this as building a building without the cornerstone. And it's like, without the cornerstone, the whole thing falls over. Without the key, you can't open the door. And so there's a sense of a fullness of the church that is meant to be exercised together. Hopefully we never have to live in doubt of that. I do not want a world where that is a real question. The college is composed of many members. The College of Bishops gathered around the Pope is composed of many members. This authority is meant to be exercised in service. It's not about one's personal preferences. It should not be about the winds of the world and changing morality to suit the times. It is an authority that's at the service of communion, that is meant to call people into communion, like we were talking about earlier, in the deep reality of what the church is. That theme of communion returns. It's so the college, the collegial authority that they're meant to exercise is not a personal authority to be in charge of. It's an authority at the service of communion. Within their own diocese, bishops occupy a somewhat analogous position to the Pope in the Universal Church, that the local diocese cannot act, does not function without her bishop, for better and for worse. And again, we have lived through an age where we've seen examples, I think, where this has gone very well. We've lived through an age where there are examples of this going very, very poorly. This authority is not meant to be obeyed blindly. It's not an authority that is an expression of power, an expression of might. Like that kind of thing should not have a place in the church. The kind of authority that we're talking about is really an invitation to humility, is to be a source of blessing and a connection to Christ, to seek the good of those around you and not your own. And I wish we saw that more often. Sadly, that kind of desire to serve people in that way, to serve humbly and to lay down one's life is very rare. Within a diocese, the bishop occupies that kind of central place, the nexus through which the diocese lives and breathes. And dioceses are gathered together into provinces. So our province is North Dakota, South Dakota, and Minnesota. There's 10 dioceses in our province. Ours is led by the Archbishop of Minneapolis-St. Paul. So each province has one archdiocese that the Archbishop presides over the province's bishops. Some decisions are made on a provincial level. For instance, Rome has delegated the authority about when days are celebrated. Ascension Thursday or Sunday, as it is here, is one of them. That's given to the provinces of the church, and provinces have to decide and come together to make a decision on those kinds of things. So this is kind of the function of the Pope and some of the hierarchy. It has each person has a particular place within that hierarchy that we'll get to. The teaching office of the church. So teaching, this is going to go through priest, prophet, and king. I guess prophet, and then priest, and then king. So prophetic office first, to preach the gospel of God. We are called to hand on the faith, not to make it, not to change it, not to make it into other things, but to try and understand what we are given as well as we can, and to be faithful transmitters of what we have received. The teaching office is something that is shared by the entire body of the faithful. that we exercise it, but in a particular way by the clergy, by deacons, by priests, and by bishops. Infallibility is one of the big questions in this area. Infallibility means that the truth cannot be lost, basically. That it's a guarantee that the salvation of Christ reaches through time. That it's not just something that comes to an end at a particular point where error can enter in. But infallibility is narrow. Very, very narrow. And it is so important to understand that. So infallibility only applies to faith and morals. It doesn't apply, for instance, to things about climate change. Pope has no competence given by God when it comes to climate change. He can say the climate is changing and it's caused by humanity. He can say that the climate is changing and it's not caused by humanity. That is a scientific question. Infallibility offers no protection and requires no obedience. Now, certainly, we should take what he has to say. There is a sense, very much like in this area, of developing a more human ecology, of rejecting pollution, of trying to find ways to take care of and be stewards of this world. Amen, amen, amen. And some of those things can be declared infallibly. Like that man is a steward of creation, that humanity has a duty to protect and safeguard the world that God has given us. Very much so. Straight out of the gospel, straight out of the book of Genesis. The Pope could define those as an article of faith. But that protection doesn't apply to areas of scientific fact outside of that. Like how that stewardship is exercised. Someone could say hydroelectric power is the best thing in the world. It's clean, it's renewable, it's there. We've discovered now that hydroelectric power comes with its own set of issues. If the Pope declares for hydroelectric power, that's a prudential decision, but it's not infallible. So the infallibility is given by Jesus himself. It's a protection and it's a guarantee of truth. It's something narrow. It is something that the Pope doesn't have alone. He doesn't possess it personally just on behalf of him, like what he says is infallible and no one else can. Infallibility applies to the entire people of God when they proclaim the truths of the faith that have always been held. Say, I believe in God the Father Almighty is infallible. Or at least that God the Father Almighty is part of the Trinity, that kind of thing. They have their infallibility because they're also part of the creedal definition of the faith. They're part of what Christianity has always taught and has always believed. People participate in this in a supernatural sense of faith. It is meant to unite us all to the truth. We don't, as people outside of the Holy Father, possess the kind of charism of infallibility personally to proclaim on different teaching, but things that the Pope has proclaimed or that are part of the Scriptures, those kinds of things. That's not something that I suppose I would mention too much because there's a lot of nuance in understanding it. It's important to realize what we're trying to say and what we're not trying to say. Infallibility isn't about defining new teaching. It's not the ability